the same thing today. They get together at somebody's house and they turn out the lights and eat popcorn and scare one another half to death. Telling scary stories is something people have done for thousands of years. For most of us, like being scared in that way. Since there isn't any danger, we think it is fun. There are great many scary stories to tell. There are ghost stories, there are tales of witches, devils, boogeymen, zombies, and vampires. There are tales of monstrous creatures and of other dangers. There are even stories that make us laugh at all this scariness. Some of these tales are very old and they are told around the world, and most have the same origins. They are based on things that people saw or heard or experienced or thought they did. Many years ago, a young prince became famous for a scary story he started to tell, but did not finish. His name was Mamilius, and he probably was 9 or 10 years old. William Shakespeare told about him in The Winter's Tale. It was a dark winter's day that his mother, the queen, asked him for a story. A sad tale's best for winter, he said. I have one of sprites and goblins. Do your best to frighten me with your sprites, she said. You are powerful at it. I shall tell it softly, he said. Yon crickets shall not hear it. And he began. There was a man developed by a churchyard, but that was as far as he got, for at that moment the king came in and arrested the queen and took her away. And soon after that, Mamilius died. No one knows how he would have finished his story if you started as he did. What would you tell? Most scary stories are, of course, meant to be told. There are more scary stories that way. But how you tell them is important. As Mamilius knew, the best way is to speak softly so that your listeners lean forward to catch your every word, and to speak slowly so that your voice sounds scary. And the best time to tell these stories is at night, in the dark and the gloom. It is easy for someone listening to imagine all sorts of strange and scary things. The Big Toe. A boy was digging at the edge of the garden when he saw a big toe. He tried to pick it But soon he heard the back door open, and again he heard the voice. Where is my doll? It groaned. Then the boy heard footsteps move through the kitchen, into the dining room, into the living room, into the front hall. They slowly climbed the stairs. Closer and closer they came. Soon they were in the upstairs hall. Now they were outside his door. Where is my doll? The voice groaned. His door opened. Shaking with fear, he listened as the footsteps slowly moved through the dark toward his bed. Then they stopped. Where is my doll? The voice groaned. At this and the boy waited for the thing to disappear and heard, and the last thing he heard was, "You've got it." When the boy hears the voice calling for its doll, he finds a strangely good-looking creature up inside the chimney. The boy is so frightened that he can't move. He just stands there and stares at it. Finally, he asks, what you got such big eyes for?" And the creature answers, "To look you through and through." What, what, what you got such big claws for?" "To scratch up your grave." What you got such a big mouth for?" "To swallow you whole." What you got such sharp teeth for?" "To chomp your bones." The next story we're going to tell is titled The Walk. My uncle was walking down a lonely dirt road one day. He came upon a man who also was walking down that road. The man looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked at the man. The man was scared of my uncle, and my uncle was scared of that man. But they kept on walking, and it began to get dark. The man looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked at the man. The man was very scared of my uncle, and my uncle was very scared of that man. But they kept on walking as they came to a big woods. It was getting darker, and faster he went. Then he stopped, and he looked into her eyes. "What do you come for?" she asked in a small voice that shivered and shook. "What do I come for?" he said. "I come for you." As Alright, this next one is titled "They Eat Your Eyes, They Eat Your Nose." There are scary stories about all kinds of things. The ones told here are about a grave, a witch, and a man who liked to swim, a hunting trip, and a market basket. There also is one about worms eating a corpse. Your corpse. The Hearst song. Don't you ever laugh as the hearse goes by, for you may be the next to die. That's the Hearst song, apparently. Okay. The girl who stood on a grave. Some boys and girls were at a party one night. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. "Don't ever stand on a grave after dark," one of the boys said. "The person inside will grab you. He'll pull you under." "That's not true," one of the girls said. "It's just a superstition." "I'll give you $1 if you stand on a grave," said the boy. "A grave doesn't scare me," said the girl. "I'll do it right now." The boy handed her his knife. "Stick this knife in one of the graves," he said. "Then we'll know you were there." The graveyard was filled with shadows and was as quiet as death. There was nothing to be scared of, the girl told herself, but she was scared. She picked out a grave and stood on it. Then quickly, she bent over and plunged the knife into the soil. And as she started to leave, but she couldn't get away. Something was holding her. She tried a second time to leave, and she couldn't move. She was filled with terror. "Something has got me," she screamed, and she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt, and it pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that held her. She had died of fright. Alligators. A young woman in town married a man from another part of the country. He was a nice fellow, and they got along pretty well together. There was only one problem. Every night he'd go swimming in the river. Sometimes he would be gone all night long, and she would complain about how lonely she was. This couple had 2 boys could walk, their father began to teach them how to swim. And when they got to be old enough, he took them swimming in the river at night. Often they would stay there all night long, and the young woman would stay home all by herself. After a while, she began to act in a strange way. At least, that is what the neighbors said. She told them that her husband was turning into an alligator and that he was trying to turn the boys into alligators. Somebody told her that there was nothing wrong with a man taking his son swimming. That was a natural thing to do, and when it came to alligators, there just weren't any nearby. Everybody knew that. Early one morning, the young woman came running into town from the direction of the river. She was soaking wet. She said a big alligator and two little alligators had pulled her in and had tried to get her to eat a raw fish. There were her husband and her sons, she said, and they wanted her to live with them. But she had gotten away. Her doctor decided she had lost her mind, and he had her put in the hospital for a while. After that, nobody saw her husband and boys again. They just disappeared. But now and then, a fisherman would tell about seeing alligators in the river at night. Usually it was one big alligator and two small ones, but people said they were just making it up. Everybody knows there aren't any alligators around here. This one's titled The Wendigo. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where few people had ever hunted. He traveled to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him, but no one would do it. It was too dangerous, they said. Finally, he found an Indian who needed money badly, and he agreed to take him. The Indian's name was Devago. They made camp in the snow near a large frozen lake. For 3 days they hunted, but they had nothing to show for it. The third night, a windstorm came up. They lay in their tent listening to the wind howling and the trees whipping back and forth. To see the storm better, the hunter opened the tent flap, but what he saw startled him. There wasn't a breath of air stirring, and the trees were standing perfectly still. Yet he could hear the wind howling, and the more he listened, the more it started to sound as if it were calling Devago's name. Devago, it called. Devago. I must be losing my mind, the hunter thought. But Devago had gotten out of his sleeping bag. He was huddled in a corner of the tent, his head buried in his arms. What's this all about? The hunter asked. It's nothing, Devago said. But the wind continued to call to him, and Devago became more tense and more restless. Devago, steps Tifago had taken got longer and longer. They were so long no human being could have taken them. It was as if something had helped him to hurry away. The hunter followed the tracks out to the middle of the lake, but there they disappeared. At first, he thought that the vehicle had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't any hole. Then he thought that something had pulled him off the ice into the sky, but that made no sense. As he stood wondering what happened, the wind picked up again. Soon it was howling as it had the night before. Then he heard Tivago's voice. It was coming from up above. And again he heard Tivago screaming, "My fiery feet, my burning feet." But there was nothing to be seen. Now the hunter wanted to leave that place as fast as he could. He went back to the camp and packed. Then he left some food for Tifago, and he started out. Weeks later, he reached civilization. The following year, he went back to hunt in the area again. He went to the same trading post to look for a guide. The people there could not explain what happened to Tifago that night, but they had not seen him since. "Maybe it was the Wendigo," one of them said, and he laughed. "It's supposed to come with the wind. It drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned away, and more of you than that. Then it carries you into the sky, and it drops you. It's just a crazy story, but that's what some of the Indians say." A few days later, the hunter was at the trading post again. An Indian came in and sat by the fire. He had a blanket wrapped around him, and he wore his hat so that you couldn't see his face. The hunter thought there was something familiar about him. He walked over and he asked, "Are you Tifago?" The Indian didn't answer. "Do you know anything about him?" No answer. He began to wonder if something was wrong, if the man needed help, but he couldn't see his face. "Are you alright?" he asked. No answer. To get a look at him, he lifted the Indian's head. Then he screamed, because there was nothing under that hat but a pile of ashes. The dead man's brains. This scary story is a scary game that people play at Halloween, but it can be played whenever the spirit moves you. The players sit in a circle in a darkened room and listen to a storyteller describe a rotting remains of a corpse. Each part is passed around for them to feel. In one version, a player is out if he or she screams or gasps with fright. In another version, everybody stays to the end, no matter how scared they get. Here is the story. Once in this town, there lived a man named Brown. It was years ago on this night that he was murdered out of spite. We have here his remains. First, let's feel his brains. A wet, squishy tomato. Now, here are his eyes, still frozen with surprise. This is his nose. Here is his ear. And here is his hand, rotting flesh and bone. But his hair still grows. And his heart still beats now and then. And his blood still flows. That's all there is, except for these worms. They are the ones that ate the rest of him. May I carry your basket? The next story's title. Sam Lewis spent the evening playing chess at his friend's house. It was about midnight when they finished their game, and he started home. Outside it was icy cold and as quiet as the grave, and he came around a turn in the road. He was surprised to see a woman walking ahead of him. She was carrying a basket covered with a white cloth. When he caught up to her, he looked to see who it was, but she was so bundled up against the cold it was hard to see her face. "Good evening," Sam said. "What brings you out so late?" But she didn't answer. Then he asked, "May I carry your basket?" She handed it to him. From under the cloth, a small voice said, "That's very nice of you." And that was followed by a wild laugh. Sam was so startled that he dropped the basket, and out whirled a woman's head. He looked at the head and stared at the woman. "It's her head," he cried, and he started to run. And the woman and her head began to chase him. Soon the head caught up to him. It bounded into the air and sunk its teeth into his left leg. Sam screamed with pain and ran faster, but the woman and her head stayed right behind him. So they leaped into the air again and bit into his other leg. Then they were gone. And all he was left with that night were 2 bite marks. She had driven into town that night to see a basketball game. Now she was on her way home. As she pulled away from the school, she noticed a red pickup truck follow her out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, the truck was still behind her. I guess we're going the same direction, she thought. She began to watch the truck in her mirror when she changed her speed. The driver of the truck changed his speed. When she passed the car, so did he. Then he turned on his high beams, flooding her car with light. He left them on for almost a minute. He probably wants to pass me, she thought, but she was becoming uneasy. Usually she drove home over a back road. Not too many people went that way, but when she turned onto the road, so did the truck. I've got to get away from him, she thought, and she began to drive faster. Then he turned on his high beams on again. After a minute, he turned them off. Then he turned them on again and off again. She drove even faster, but the truck driver stayed right behind her. Then he turned his high beams on again. Once more, her car was ablaze with light. What is he doing? She wondered. What does he want? Then he turned them off again, but a minute later, he had them on again, and he left them on. At last she pulled onto her driveway, and the truck pulled in right behind her. She jumped from the car and ran in the house, called the police. She screamed at her father. Out in the driveway, she could see the driver of the truck. He had a gun in his hand. When the police arrived, they started to arrest him, but he pointed to the girl's car. You don't want me, he said. You want him. Crouched behind the driver's seat, there was a man with a knife. As the driver of the truck explained it, the man slipped into the girl's car just before she left the school. He saw it happen, but there was no way he could stop it. He thought about getting the police, but he was afraid to leave her, so he followed her car. Each time the man in the back seat reached up to overpower her, the driver of the truck turned on his high beams. Then the man dropped down, afraid that someone might see him. The next story is called The Babysitter. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. Everybody was sitting on the couch in front of the TV. There was a Richard, Brian, Jenny, and Doreen, the babysitter. The telephone rang. Maybe it's your mother, said Doreen. She picked up the phone. Before she could say a word, a man laughed hysterically and hung up. Who was it? Asked Richard. Some nut, said Doreen. What did I miss? At 9:30, the telephone rang again. Doreen answered it. It was the man who had called before. I'll be there soon, he said, and he laughed and hung up. Who was it? The children asked. Some crazy person, she said. At about 10 o'clock, the phone rang again. Jenny got to it first. Hello, she said. It was the same man. 1 more hour, he said, and he laughed and hung up. He said 1 more hour. What did he mean? Asked Jenny. Don't worry, said Doreen. It's somebody fooling around. I'm scared, said Jenny. About 10:30, the phone rang once again. When Doreen picked it up, the man said, "Pretty soon now," and he laughed. "Why are you doing this?" Doreen screamed, and he hung up. "Was it that guy again?" asked Brian. "Yes," said Doreen. "I'm going to call the operator and complain." The operator told her to call back if anything happened again, and she would try to trace the call. At 11 o'clock, the telephone rang again. Doreen answered it. "Very soon now," the man said, and he laughed and hung up. Doreen called the operator. Almost at once, she called back. "That person is calling from a telephone upstairs," she said. "You better leave. I'll get the police." Just then, a door upstairs opened. A man they had never seen before started down the stairs towards them. As I ran from the house, he was smiling in a very strange way. A few minutes later, the police found him there and arrested him. Aaron Kelly's bones. Aaron Kelly was dead. They bought him a coffin and had a funeral and buried him. But that night he got out of his coffin and he came home. His family was sitting around the fire when he had walked in. He sat down next to his widow and he said, "What's going on? Y'all, you all act like somebody died. Who's dead?" His widow said, "You are." "I don't feel dead," he said. "I feel fine." "You don't look fine," his widow said. "You look dead. You better get back to the grave where you belong." "I'm not going back to that grave until I feel dead," he said. Since Aaron wouldn't go back, his widow couldn't collect his life insurance. Without that, she couldn't pay for the coffin. Then the undertaker said he would take it back. Aaron didn't care. He just sat by the fire, rocking in a chair and warming his hands and feet. But his joints were dry and his back was stiff. Every time he moved, he creaked and cracked.